The gunshot that killed Clara Vance's husband didn't just take his life, it took every dream she'd ever dared to whisper into the darkness. And when the preacher spoke those hollow words of comfort at the funeral, her sister leaned close and said what everyone else was thinking. "You'll never be happy again, Clara. Some losses are just too great." Clara stood in the dusty cemetery outside Montrose, Colorado, on that sweltering August afternoon in 1878, watching them lower Thomas into the ground. The San Juan Mountains rose in the distance, indifferent to her grief, and she felt something inside her chest crystallize into stone. 23 years old, widowed after only 8 months of marriage, and pregnant with a child her husband would never meet. The women of the town had already started their whispers, their predictions about her future painted in shades of gray and loneliness. Mrs. Henderson had clutched her hand with pitying eyes and said she'd likely end up working as a seamstress in the back of some shop, raising her baby alone in a rented room. Her own mother, bless her departed soul, had always warned that happiness was a fragile thing, easily shattered. The weeks that followed proved everyone right. Clara moved through her days like a ghost, selling off the small ranch Thomas had been building for them, piece by piece, until all that remained was enough money to rent a modest room above the general store. She took in laundry and mending, her fingers working mechanically while her mind stayed trapped in that moment when the sheriff had knocked on her door to deliver the news. Thomas had been shot during a dispute over cattle rights, a senseless argument that had escalated too quickly, ending with him bleeding out in the dirt before anyone could fetch the doctor. September arrived with cooler winds sweeping down from the mountains, and Clara's belly began to show beneath her mourning dress. She avoided mirrors, avoided conversations, avoided anything that might make her feel the full weight of her circumstances. The baby moved inside her sometimes, little flutters that should have brought joy but instead felt like accusations. How could she bring a child into this world when she had nothing left to give? It was on a Tuesday morning while she was hanging laundry behind the general store that she first heard his voice. "Madam, I believe you dropped this." Clara turned to find a tall man holding out one of her clothespins, his hat tipped back enough to reveal dark hair and eyes the color of strong coffee. He wore the practical clothes of a working cowboy: dusty denim, a worn leather vest, boots that had seen 1,000 miles. Something about his face made her pause. There was a gentleness there, unusual in the hard men who drifted through Montrose looking for ranch work or heading toward the mining camps in the high country. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, taking the clothespin. She expected him to leave, but he stood there, shifting his weight slightly. "Name is Quinn Quade," he said. "Just hired on at the Riverside Ranch about 5 miles north of town. I noticed you struggling with that basket. It looks mighty heavy. I can manage." Clara's voice came out sharper than she intended. She didn't want pity, didn't want some stranger trying to ease his conscience by helping the poor widow woman. Quinn nodded slowly, as if hearing all the things she hadn't said. "I'm sure you can, madam, but that doesn't mean you should have to." He touched the brim of his hat and walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing there with wet sheets in her arms and confusion replacing the numbness she'd wrapped around herself like armor. She saw him again 3 days later at the mercantile, buying supplies. He nodded to her politely, but didn't approach. Then again the following week at church, where he sat in the back row with the other ranch hands. Clara found herself noticing things about him despite her determination not to notice anything at all. The way he helped Mrs. Peterson carry her groceries to her wagon without being asked. How he broke up a fight between 2 drunks outside the saloon, using nothing but calm words and a steady presence. small kindnesses that seemed to come naturally to him. October painted the aspens gold, and Clara's body grew heavier with the approaching birth. She'd stopped taking laundry that required heavy lifting, which meant less money, which meant more worry. She was calculating whether she could afford both rent and food for the coming month when Quinn appeared at her door one evening, hat in hand. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I hope I'm not being too forward, but I heard you might need help with some repairs. Your landlord mentioned the window frame is broken, and with winter coming, you'll need it fixed properly." Clara stood in the doorway, one hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. "I can't afford to pay for repairs right now." "Didn't ask for payment," Quinn said simply. "I've got some spare lumber at the ranch, and I know my way around a hammer. If you'll permit me, I could come by Saturday afternoon and fix it for you." Every instinct told her to refuse. Accepting help meant acknowledging need, meant opening a door she'd worked hard to keep closed. But the nights were already cold, and she could feel the draft through that broken window frame. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if casting its own vote. "Saturday afternoon," she agreed finally. "But I'll make you dinner in exchange. I won't accept charity." Something flickered in Quinn's eyes, respect, maybe, or understanding. "That's a fair trade, madam. I'll be here around 2 o'clock. He arrived exactly on time that Saturday, carrying a toolbox and several pieces of cut lumber. Clara watched from inside as he worked, his movements efficient and practiced. He whistled while he hammered, some tune she didn't recognize, and she found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in months, a tiny spark of curiosity about another person's story. Who was Quinn Quade? Where had he come from? Why was he spending his one free afternoon fixing a stranger's window? When he finished, she invited him inside for the meal she'd prepared: venison stew, biscuits, and apple pie made from fruit she'd preserved before Thomas died. Quinn removed his hat and sat at her small table, and for the first time since the funeral, Clara shared a meal with another person. "This is delicious," Quinn said after his first bite. "Haven't had cooking this good since I left home." "Where is home?" Clara asked, surprising herself with the question. Was Montana Territory originally? Little town called Virginia City. My father had a small spread there, raised cattle and horses. Quinn broke open a biscuit, releasing steam. "He died when I was 17, and my mother followed a year later. Broke her heart, losing him. After that, I sold the place and started drifting. Worked ranches all through Wyoming, down into New Mexico Territory, up through Utah. Been moving for about 6 years now." Clara set down her spoon. "That's a long time to be alone." "Could say the same about you, couldn't I?" Quinn's eyes met hers, gentle but direct. "Though I suspect you haven't been alone long enough to get used to it yet." The words should have hurt, should have reopened the wound that was still raw and bleeding. Instead, Clara found herself really talking for the first time since Thomas died. She told Quinn about her husband, about the senseless way he'd died, about the future they'd planned that would never happen. She told him about the baby, about her fear that she wouldn't be enough, that she'd already failed before she'd even begun. "Your sister told me I'd never be happy again," Clara said quietly, staring at her hands. "The day of the funeral, and I think she might be right. I think maybe happiness was something I only got to borrow for a little while, and now I have to pay it all back with interest." Quinn was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "Then let me try to prove them wrong." Clara's head snapped up. "What?" "Let me try to prove them wrong," Quinn repeated. "All those people who have decided your story is already over. I don't believe that's true. I don't believe any loss, no matter how great, means you're done feeling joy or hope or love. But I understand why you might not believe it yourself right now. So let me try to show you differently." You don't even know me, Clara whispered. Why would you care what happens to me? Quinn leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Because I've been where you are. Maybe not the exact same circumstances, but I know what it feels like to think everything good is behind you. After my mother died, I spent 2 years just going through the motions, working ranches and sleeping under stars and never connecting to anything or anyone. I thought that was just how life was going to be from then on. Then one day, I was helping an old rancher round up some strays, and we found this newborn calf that had been abandoned by its mother. It was weak, probably wouldn't make it. And that rancher, he could have just put it down, saved it the suffering. But instead he carried it back to the barn, spent weeks nursing it with a bottle, sitting up nights to keep it warm, and eventually that calf grew strong. It lived. I'm not a calf, Clara said, but there was no anger in her voice. No, you're not, but the principle is the same. Sometimes we all need someone who refuses to give up on us, even when we've given up on ourselves. I'd like to be that person for you, if you'll let me. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself since the funeral. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I have anything left to give. Then don't give anything, Quinn said. Just receive for a while. Let someone take care of you until you're strong enough to stand on your own again. No obligations, no expectations. Just help when you need it and company when you can bear it. She should have said no. Every rational part of her mind screamed that this was too much, too soon, too complicated. But the baby kicked again, hard enough to make her gasp, and she thought about the long winter ahead, about facing it all alone in this small room above the general store, about bringing a child into the world with no one beside her. All right, Clara heard herself say. All right. Over the next weeks, Quinn became a steady presence in her life. He came by on Saturdays to help with tasks that were growing beyond her physical capabilities, carrying water, chopping wood, checking the stove pipe. He never stayed too long, never pushed beyond the boundaries she'd set, but his reliability itself was a gift. She began to look forward to those Saturday afternoons, to the sound of his footsteps on the stairs, to the easy conversation that flowed between them while they worked. He told her about his travels, about the ranch in Wyoming where he'd learned to break horses, about the winter he'd spent snowed in at a lined shack in the mountains with nothing but 2 other cowboys and a deck of cards for entertainment. He talked about his parents, about the love they'd shared that had been so complete that losing one meant losing both. And Clara began to understand that Quinn knew grief intimately, that his offer to help wasn't born from pity, but from genuine understanding. She, in turn, told him about her childhood in Kansas, about coming west with her family when she was 15, about meeting Thomas at a church social and knowing immediately that he was the man she'd marry. She talked about the dreams they'd had for their ranch, about the house Thomas had been building with his own hands, about the morning she'd found out she was pregnant, and how they danced in the kitchen like fools. He was a good man, Quinn said one afternoon in early November while splitting wood behind the general store. From everything you've told me, he was the kind of man who deserved a long life with you. It's not fair that he didn't get it. No, it's not, Clara agreed. She was sitting on a bench watching him work, her swollen feet propped up. But fair doesn't seem to be how the world operates. Quinn sank the axe into the chopping block and wiped his brow. The day was cold, but the work had warmed him. Can I ask you something personal? You've fixed my window, chopped my wood, and carried more water than I can count. I think we're past the point of worrying about personal questions. Do you feel guilty? Quinn asked. For starting to feel better. For having moments where you're not drowning in grief, Clara's breath caught. He'd hit on something she'd barely admitted to herself. Yes, she whispered. Sometimes I'll catch myself almost smiling at something, or I'll realize I haven't thought about Thomas for a whole hour, and it feels like betrayal. Like I'm supposed to stay frozen in that moment forever, or else it means I didn't really love him. Quinn came to sit beside her on the bench, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. My mother felt that way after my father died. She'd apologize when she laughed at something, like she needed permission to still be alive. And I think that guilt is what really killed her, not the influenza. She couldn't forgive herself for continuing to breathe when he couldn't. I used to wish I could have told her that loving someone doesn't mean dying with them. It means carrying them forward, letting their memory live in the good things you do and feel, not in making yourself a monument to loss. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the pain that lived behind his kindness. You think about what you tell her a lot, don't you? Every day, Quinn admitted. Every single day, which is part of why I want to help you. Maybe if I can keep you from making the same mistake she did, it'll mean something. Maybe it'll mean her death taught me something useful. Without thinking, Clara reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough from work, warm despite the cold air. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me. For not giving up." Quinn's fingers curled around hers, gentle but firm. "I'm not going anywhere, Clara, not until you tell me to go." The first snow fell in mid-November, and with it came the realization that Clara's time was approaching. The midwife, Mrs. Daniels, told her the baby would likely come before Christmas. Clara tried not to think about going through labor alone, about bringing a child into the world with no husband beside her, no family to help. Her sister had moved to California the month before, too consumed with her own life to linger in Montrose. The other women in town were kind but distant, their lives too full to take on someone else's burden. Quinn must have sensed her growing anxiety because he started coming by more often Wednesdays in addition to Saturdays, just to check on her, to make sure she had everything she needed. He brought her firewood without being asked, left baskets of supplies on her doorstep with no explanation. One evening he appeared with a carved wooden cradle, beautiful and sturdy, the wood sanded smooth as silk. "Quinn, this is too much," Clara protested, running her hand over the craftsmanship. "This must have taken you weeks." "About a month," Quinn said. "Been working on it in the evenings at the bunkhouse. Figured every baby needs a proper place to sleep." He shifted his weight, suddenly looking uncertain. "If you'd rather not have it, I understand. I don't want to overstep." "Overstep?" Clara felt something crack open in her chest, warm and bright and terrifying. "You've been nothing but respectful and kind. This cradle is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me, for my baby." She looked up at him, vision blurring with tears. "Why are you doing all this, Quinn? Really?" He met her eyes, and she saw something there that made her heart stutter. "Because the first time I saw you hanging that laundry, fighting so hard to keep going when everything in you probably wanted to give up, I thought you were the bravest person I'd ever met. And then I talked to you, and I realized you were also smart and funny and strong in ways that have nothing to do with physical labor. And somewhere along the way, helping you stopped being about easing my own past grief and started being about something else entirely." "What?" Clara whispered, though she thought she knew. "About the fact that I'm falling in love with you," Quinn said simply, "and I know the timing is terrible. I know you're still grieving your husband, and you're about to have his baby, and the last thing you probably want is some drifter cowboy complicating your life. But you asked for the truth, and that's it. I love you, Clara. And whether you can ever love me back or not, I'm still going to be here, helping however I can for as long as you'll allow it." Clara stood frozen, one hand still on the cradle, her mind spinning. She should tell him it was too soon, too complicated, too impossible. She should protect herself and him from the messy reality of trying to build something new on the ruins of what she'd lost. But looking at Quinn, at the man who'd shown up every single time he'd promised, who'd never asked for anything in return, who'd made her feel seen and valued when she'd been certain she'd never feel anything again, she couldn't lie. "I don't know if what I feel is love yet," she said slowly. "I don't know if I'm capable of that right now. But I know that when you're here, the world feels less heavy. I know that I think about you when you're gone. I know that when I imagine the future now, you're in it somehow. And that terrifies me, Quinn, because everyone I've ever loved has left me, one way or another." Quinn stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I can't promise I'll never die, Clara. None of us can promise that. But I can promise I'll never choose to leave you. I can promise that every day I'm breathing, I'll be trying my best to prove that happiness isn't something you had, and lost it's something that can come around again, different maybe, but just as real." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble of his jaw, the realness of him. "Then let's see if you're right," she whispered. "Let's see if they're wrong about me." Quinn leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and kissed her forehead with such tenderness that Clara felt the last of her walls begin to crumble. It wasn't passion, not yet. It was promise. It was possibility. It was the first step on a path she'd been told she'd never walk again. The baby came 3 weeks later, on a snowy December night when the world was hushed and white. The labor was long and brutal, and there were moments when Clara thought she might not survive it, might join Thomas in whatever came after this life. But Quinn was there, having camped out on the landing outside her room despite her protests, and when she cried out, he was the one who ran for Mrs. Daniels, the one who waited just outside the door, the one who paced and prayed and refused to leave until it was over. At dawn on December 8th, Clara's son was born, a healthy, squalling baby with a fierce grip in Thomas's dark hair. She held him and wept, grieving anew for the father who would never meet this perfect child, but also feeling a fierce, protective love that gave her new strength. When Mrs. Daniels finally allowed Quinn in to meet the baby, Clara saw tears in his eyes. "He's beautiful," Quinn said hoarsely. "Perfect. What will you name him?" "Thomas," Clara said without hesitation. "Thomas Vance, after his father, but we'll call him Tommy so he can be his own person too." Quinn reached out and gently touched the baby's tiny hand. Tommy grabbed his finger immediately, holding on with surprising strength. "Hello, Tommy," Quinn whispered. "I'm very pleased to meet you." Over the next months, Quinn became as essential to their lives as breathing. He taught Clara how to manage the baby in those exhausting early weeks when she was running on no sleep and raw nerves. He walked the floor with Tommy when the baby had colic, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice until Tommy finally settled. He brought them food, made sure the stove stayed stocked with wood, and somehow managed to work a full day at the ranch and still show up every evening to help. The people of Montrose noticed, of course. Small towns always noticed. There were whispers about the widow and the cowboy, speculation about what was really happening between them. But Clara found she didn't care. For the first time since Thomas died, she was focused on moving forward rather than surviving, on building rather than enduring. Spring came to Colorado in a rush of wildflowers and snowmelt, and Tommy grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, happy baby who smiled at everything and everyone. Clara found herself smiling back, found herself laughing at Quinn's stories, found herself feeling something she'd thought was gone forever: joy. One evening in April, after Tommy was asleep in his cradle, Quinn sat at Clara's table and cleared his throat nervously. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything." Clara set down her mending, suddenly anxious. "All right. The Riverside Ranch is being sold," Quinn said. "The owner is retiring, moving back east to live with his daughter. The new owner already has his own crew, which means we're all being let go come May." Clara's heart dropped. "You're leaving?" "Let me finish," Quinn said gently. "I've been saving my wages for the past 6 years, almost every penny I've earned since I started drifting. I've got enough now to buy a small place. Nothing fancy, but decent land with water rights and a sturdy cabin. There's a property for sale about 10 miles north of here, up in the valley where Cowboy Creek runs down from the mountains. It's good cattle country and the cabin is small but well built. Needs some fixing up, but I can do that." "That sounds wonderful," Clara said, not understanding where this was going. "You'd be a good rancher, Quinn." "The thing is," Quinn continued, "I don't want to do it alone. And I don't want to be 10 miles away from you and Tommy, seeing you once a week if I'm lucky. So I'm asking, and I know this is complicated, and I know there are 1,000 reasons you might say no, but I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me. If you'd consider letting me be Tommy's father, not to replace Thomas, but to give him someone who'll love him and raise him and teach him how to be a good man. And if you'd consider giving us a real chance at the kind of life we've both been through too much to take for granted." Clara stared at him, her heart pounding. "Quinn, I love you," he said simply. "I've loved you since that day with the clothespin, maybe before that even. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you love Tommy so fiercely. I love how you're honest about your grief instead of pretending it doesn't exist. I love that you let me in even when everything in you wanted to keep everyone out. And I hope that maybe you love me too, at least a little." "More than a little," Clara whispered. "So much more than a little that it scares me." Quinn reached across the table and took her hands. "Then marry me. Let me prove to everyone who said you'd never be happy again that they were wrong. Let me spend the rest of my life making sure you wake up every day knowing you're loved and valued and cherished. Let me be Tommy's father and your husband and the man who gets to stand beside you through whatever comes next." Clara looked down at their joined hands, at the calluses they'd both earned through hard work, at the way their fingers fit together like they'd been designed that way. She thought about Thomas, about the love they'd shared that had been real and true and cut too short. But she also thought about what Quinn had said months ago, about carrying love forward rather than turning it into a monument to loss. "Thomas would have liked you," she said quietly. "He would have trusted you to take care of us, and I think he'd want me to be happy. I think he'd want Tommy to have a father who's present and loving, not just a memory." "Is that a yes?" Quinn asked, his voice rough with hope. Clara looked up and smiled, a real smile, the kind she'd thought she'd never smile again. "Yes. Yes, Quinn Quade, I'll marry you." They were married in May, in the small church where Clara had buried Thomas less than a year before. The ceremony was simple, attended by a handful of townspeople and the few ranch hands who'd become Quinn's friends. Tommy fussed through the vows, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the baby let out a shriek that made everyone laugh. Clara didn't mind. It felt right, having Tommy there, being reminded that life continued, that love could bloom even in the ruins of loss. They moved to the ranch in early June, and Clara fell in love with the valley immediately. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms and a loft, but Quinn had cleaned it thoroughly and made repairs to the roof and windows. Cowboy Creek ran clear and cold through the property, and wildflowers covered the meadows in riots of purple and yellow. The mountains rose up all around them, protective and eternal. Quinn worked from dawn until dusk, building fences and preparing for the small herd of cattle he'd purchased with the last of his savings. Clara took care of Tommy and started a garden, planting vegetables and herbs in the rich soil near the creek. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch together while Tommy played on a blanket at their feet, watching the sun set behind the peaks and talking about their plans. "I want to add another room next summer," Quinn said one night, his arm around Clara's shoulders. "Maybe 2 rooms. Give Tommy his own space as he grows and leave room for—" He stopped abruptly. "For what?" Clara asked, though she knew. "For brothers or sisters," Quinn said carefully. "If that's something you'd want. Eventually. I know Tommy's still little, and I know you went through a lot with his birth. There's no rush, but I hope someday we might have more children together." Clara leaned into him, feeling safe in a way she'd never expected to feel again. "I'd like that," she said. "Not right away, but yes, I'd like Tommy to have siblings. I'd like to have children with you, Quinn. Children who'll grow up knowing their parents love them and each other, who'll run through these meadows and swim in that creek and never doubt that they're wanted." Quinn pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You're happy," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I am," Clara realized with a start. "I'm actually happy. They were wrong, all of them. My sister, Mrs. Henderson, everyone who said I'd never feel this way again. They were all wrong." "I told you I'd prove them wrong," Quinn reminded her, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Yes, you did," Clara agreed. "And you kept your promise." That summer passed in a golden haze of hard work and growing love. Tommy learned to crawl, then to pull himself up on furniture, his personality emerging as curious and determined. Quinn taught him to clap his hands and make silly faces, and Tommy would shriek with laughter until Clara thought her heart might burst from the joy of it. She'd catch herself watching them together, Quinn tossing Tommy in the air while the baby giggled, or the two of them napping on the porch. Tommy sprawled across Quinn's chest and feel overwhelmed with gratitude. The ranch prospered modestly. Quinn's cattle thrived on the summer grass, and he hired a couple of seasonal hands to help with the heavy work. Clara sold vegetables and preserves in town, earning enough to buy fabric for clothes and small luxuries. They weren't wealthy, but they had enough. More than enough. In October, Clara realized she was pregnant again. She told Quinn one evening after Tommy was asleep, nervous about his reaction. They talked about more children, but she wasn't sure he'd expected it to happen so soon. Quinn's face split into a grin so wide it made her laugh. "Really?" "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be at this stage," Clara said. "The baby should come in late May or early June if my calculations are right." Quinn swept her into his arms and spun her around the small kitchen, then immediately set her down, looking concerned. "Sorry, is that all right?" "Should I not do that? I don't want to hurt you or the baby." "We're fine," Clara assured him, laughing. "Both of us are fine, more than fine. We're happy." The pregnancy was easier than her first had been, perhaps because she wasn't carrying the weight of grief alongside the baby. Quinn doted on her, insisting she rest more and work less, taking on extra tasks around the ranch without complaint. Tommy, now a toddling 15-month-old, seemed to sense something was changing and became extra clingy with his mother, following her around the cabin and demanding to be held. "He's going to be a good big brother," Quinn said one night, watching Tommy help Clara fold laundry by pulling everything back out of the basket and throwing it on the floor. "I hope so," Clara said. "I hope they're close, the way I was never close with my sister." Winter came hard that year with deep snows that kept them mostly confined to the ranch. But Clara didn't mind. The cabin was warm, well stocked with food and firewood, and she had her family around her. Quinn spent the long evenings teaching Tommy to stack blocks and sing songs, while Clara worked on baby clothes and blankets. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when Tommy was asleep and the fire burned low, Quinn would put his hand on her growing belly and talk to the baby, telling stories about the mountains and the ranch, about Tommy and Clara, about the life that was waiting. The baby arrived on June 2nd, 1879, after a much shorter labor than Tommy's had been. This time, the midwife let Quinn stay in the room, and he held Clara's hand through every contraction, murmuring encouragement and love. When their daughter finally arrived, tiny and perfect with a crown of light brown hair, Quinn wept openly. "She's beautiful," he whispered, cradling the baby in his large hands with infinite gentleness. "She looks just like you." "Quincy," Clara said, watching him with their daughter. "We'll name her Quincy Vance Quade after her father." Quinn's head snapped up. "You don't have to, I want to," Clara interrupted. "You're her father in every way that matters, just like you're Tommy's father in every way that matters. Our daughter should carry your name." Tommy, who'd been staying with a neighbor during the birth, was brought home that afternoon and introduced to his sister. He peered into the cradle with suspicion, poked her gently, then announced, "Baby," with great authority before running off to play with his blocks. Quinn and Clara laughed until they cried, exhausted and overwhelmed and happier than seemed possible. The years that followed were full of the ordinary magic of a life well lived. The ranch continued to grow, and Quinn's reputation as an honest, skilled rancher spread through the valley. They added the rooms he'd promised, giving the children space to grow. Tommy became a serious, thoughtful boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to ride and rope and care for cattle. Quincy grew into a wild, joyful little girl who climbed trees and caught frogs and refused to be left behind when her father and brother rode out to check the herds. In the spring of 1882, Clara gave birth to their second son, whom they named Joshua. And 2 years after that, another daughter arrived, sweet and gentle Sarah, who seemed content to watch the world rather than charge into it like her sister did. The cabin expanded again, and they built a proper barn and workshop. They bought more land, more cattle. They became pillars of the small community that was developing in the valley, hosting dances and helping neighbors during hard times. Clara never forgot what it felt like to be alone and grieving, to think happiness was beyond her reach, and she made sure to extend kindness to anyone who seemed to be struggling. Tommy grew tall and strong, eventually taking on more responsibility at the ranch. When he turned 16, Quinn legally adopted him, and Tommy officially became Thomas Quade. The boy cried when he signed the papers, and Quinn held him the way he had when Tommy was small, assuring him that taking a new name didn't mean forgetting his birth father, it meant honoring all the people who'd loved him. Quincy married a young rancher from the next valley over when she was 19. A good man named Daniel, who reminded Clara a little of Quinn with his quiet strength and steady kindness. Joshua showed more interest in books than cattle and eventually went to Denver to study law, though he came home every summer. Sarah married a teacher and settled in Montrose, close enough to visit regularly. Through all of it, Clara and Quinn's love deepened and matured, becoming something solid and unshakable. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, even as their hair turned gray and their bodies grew slower. They still talked about their dreams, though now those dreams included grandchildren and watching their children build their own lives. They still held hands and kissed goodnight and woke up grateful for another day together. One summer evening in 1902, 24 years after the day Quinn had said, "Then let me try to prove them wrong," Clara and Quinn sat on their porch watching the sunset. Tommy and his wife were visiting with their 3 children, and the sound of the grandchildren playing echoed through the valley. Quincy had ridden over earlier with news that she was expecting her 4th baby. Joshua had sent a letter saying he'd won an important case. Sarah had stopped by that morning with fresh bread and stories about her students. "You remember," Clara said quietly, When I told you what my sister said at Thomas's funeral, that I'd never be happy again, Quinn's hand tightened around hers. I remember. She was so wrong, Clara said, her voice full of wonder. Not just a little wrong, completely, entirely wrong. I've been so happy, Quinn, happier than I ever imagined possible. We've had a good life, Quinn agreed. A really good life, more than good, Clara insisted. Extraordinary. And all because you refused to accept what everyone else had decided was true. All because you looked at a grieving widow hanging laundry and thought she deserved another chance at joy. Quinn turned to face her, his eyes still the same warm brown they'd been all those years ago, though now surrounded by wrinkles earned from decades of sun and laughter. I didn't give you another chance at joy, Clara. That's not how it works. You chose joy. You chose to keep going, to let me in, to risk loving again after loss. I just offered. You're the one who was brave enough to accept. We were both brave, Clara said. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the way she'd done 1,000 times before, and watched their grandchildren chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. We were both brave, and we were both right. Love doesn't end just because loss happens. It changes, maybe. It gets complicated. But it doesn't end unless we let it. No, Quinn agreed softly. It doesn't end. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge above the mountains, as the creek sang its eternal song, as the life they'd built together hummed on around them. Somewhere inside the house, Tommy laughed at something one of the children said. A cow lowed in the distance. The wind carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Clara thought about Thomas sometimes still, always with love, never with the crushing grief that had once threatened to destroy her. She'd told Tommy stories about his birth father, made sure he knew the good man he'd come from. But she'd also made sure he knew the good man who'd raised him, who'd chosen him, who'd loved him as fiercely as any biological father could. She thought about the baby version of Quincy she'd been afraid to hope for, and the strong woman her daughter had become. She thought about Joshua's quick mind and Sarah's gentle heart, about the grandchildren who carried pieces of her and Quinn and Thomas and all the generations that had come before, woven together into something new and beautiful. Thank you, Clara whispered into the darkness. For proving them wrong, for proving that happy endings aren't just for the people who never lose anything, for showing me that second chances are real. Quinn pressed a kiss to her silver hair. Thank you for letting me try. For being brave enough to believe me when I said I'd love you for the rest of my life. For giving me Tommy and Quincy and Joshua and Sarah. For building this life with me. I'd do it all again, Clara said. Every moment, every choice, every risk, I'd do it all again exactly the same way. Me too, Quinn said. Me too, my love. Inside the house, someone called them to dinner, and Quinn helped Clara to her feet the way he would for the rest of their days, always patient, always gentle, always there. They walked inside together, hand in hand, into the warm light and noise and love of their family, into the life they'd built from the ruins of loss and the courage of hope. The people of Montrose still told the story sometimes, of the widow who'd lost everything and the drifter cowboy who'd refused to let her stay lost. They told it at weddings and christenings, whenever someone seemed to be giving up on happiness. They told it as proof that endings weren't always final, that darkness wasn't always permanent, that love could indeed bloom again even in the hardest soil. And Clara and Quinn Quade lived the rest of their lives as testimony to that truth, surrounded by children and grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren, their love a beacon that proved wrong every person who'd ever said happiness was a one-time gift. They worked their ranch and served their community, and loved each other through all the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life well lived. until they were both very old and very grateful and ready to rest. When Quinn finally passed in the spring of 1920, surrounded by family, holding Clara's hand until the very last moment, his final words were, "See, I told you I could prove them wrong." And Clara, through her tears, had to laugh and agree that yes, he absolutely had. She followed him 5 years later, content and complete. Her last conscious thought a prayer of gratitude for the second chance she'd almost been too afraid to take, for the cowboy who'd offered to prove the world wrong, and for every single day of the extraordinary life they'd built together. Her children and grandchildren gathered around her bed, and the last thing she saw before closing her eyes for the final time was all the love she'd helped create, all the joy that had come from refusing to accept that her story was over. And in the valley where Tabeguach Creek still runs clear and cold, where wildflowers still bloom every summer and the mountains still stand eternal, the ranch house they'd built together still stood for decades more, shelter for new families, new love stories, new proofs that happiness is never truly lost, only waiting for someone brave enough to reach for it again.